Rook plus 2 pawns versus rook. Disconnected pawns. So disconnected pawns are not as good as connected pawns, obviously, but at the end of the day, it's 2 pawns. And we know there's lots of rook plus 1 pawn versus rook that's just completely winning for the attacking side. A lot of those positions are sort of finely balanced. To have an extra pawn somewhere else on the board is obviously a massive advantage. And in fact, one of the best winning strategies is to just use your extra pawn. You use one of your 2 pawns to just do something to take the defending side's king or rook out of position to the point that they're in a losing rook and 1 pawn versus rook situation. Like to say, you can imagine, for example, without even thinking about this position, if the white king comes over and takes this, they can't then get back in time to the f1 square in a Philidor setup or whatever. So yeah, that's one of the main winning strategies. For the defending side, your best chance of being able to get anything out of the game, a couple of things really actually. So your best chances of getting anything out of the game is if your opponent's pieces are badly placed and your pieces are very well placed, but also if your opponent gets a bit complacent. Okay, all the positions we're about to look at, or at least the first 4, I think I've got 5 games, the first 4, there's examples of complacency. It must have been complacency from some of the best players in the world at the time. I mean, literally the best players in the world at the time, playing moves that they must have been complacent, because they're just analysable, if that's a word. That they're just throwing away the win. Not always snapped up, by the way, by the other side. But yeah, complacency from the opponent, and then maybe the odd tactical shot here or there. We should always be on the lookout for stalemate, shouldn't we? Stalemate traps. So that's your best chance as the defending side. Let's look at a few positions. Straight away, we've got an example of complacency. This is black to move. This is a game from 1946. Smyslov is actually black. I've got a feeling he might even have been world champion at the time, or certainly we know he was a world champion. I don't really know when, actually. My history of chess is very poor. But what would you do here as black? This position is massively winning for black. The engine is giving rook e3 check as -10. A simple move for a human to see is king e4. This rook's defending the b pawn, so just bring your king over. As a general rule in rook endings, if there are more pawns about, your king should go to help the pawn, like your passed pawn, and then you'd use your rook to block your opponent's passed pawn. But your opponent doesn't have a passed pawn here, but we're still going to move our king towards the pawn that's away from the defending king. So king e4 just wins very easily. The engine likes rook e3 check. But Smyslov just observed, well, I can play b2 here because that pawn's poisoned. White can't take that pawn, obviously, because they lose their rook. And it's just a moment of madness, isn't it? Just a complete lapse of concentration. And when that hit the board, wow, that would be not a comfortable afternoon and evening for him. I'd be spitting feathers all the way back to the hotel if and that's someone of my level, let alone a world champion. Yeah, that rook can't be taken. Rook h2 check. The king slips into this f3 square, and if the rook's taken, it's stalemate. Realising his mistake, he now played king g4, king f1. They just agree to draw. It's the Philidor position, more or less. I mean, the black rook's on this rank for now, but yeah, there's just no way for black to make progress there. Right, next, this is a game from 1968. It is white to play, obviously, because white is in check. Where would you put your king? There's actually only one winning move here for white in terms of where you put the king. In the game, white decided to move the king forward, which was sensible, to be honest. You don't really want to block it. You block your own h-pawn, like the rook could come to c4, and already, you know, a king g3 threatened. This h-pawn's looking a bit precarious. Or even once the king's got to g3, rook check and picking up the pawn. But you don't really want to block your own pawn. So you want to go forward. Going forward's a good idea. But you don't want to go forward to the g7 square. This might not have been complacency so much, I'm not sure. But, you know, king g7, I'm positive it was played with the intention that when black plays king g4, white will just come and stop his h-pawn being nabbed with rook d4 check. But unfortunately, this runs into king h5, and all of a sudden, you can't defend your h-pawn and your c-pawn. You might be looking at the screen thinking, what are you talking about? You just pushed your c-pawn. This is great stuff from white. You know, you got your rook in a perfect place. That setup, by the way, is almost a guarantee of a win. If you've got two passed pawns against none, and your rook's defending both of them laterally, the other side's in big trouble. We even saw that in A and H pawns. Even in A and H pawns, once the white rook's defending them laterally like that, black doesn't stand a chance. Here, unfortunately, there's a tactical shot, and it's because the g7 king is covering the h6 square, and now that's just completely drawn. Realising he'd messed it up, white played rook h2 instead. I'll get back to that in a sec. But in the original position, king f7, just completely winning for white. There's just, I mean, what can black do here? King g4. We are going to see that rook d4 followed by c4. So yeah, realising he can't now come to h5 after, realising he now can't play rook d4 check. White tried to defend the h-pawn from h2, but the king just attacked the rook. It drops back to h1, and black just nabs the c-pawn. h5, I mean, it looks quite good, doesn't it? An h-pawn with the rook sort of behind it. But white's king's just got no cover. So black just goes on a check the hell out of the white king mission, and then drops the rook into h6. The white king desperately tries to get back, but the black king can hassle the white rook now in a sort of, we'll see the game end in a pendulum, and they agree to draw there. Right, next, this is a game from 1993. It's actually Kasparov versus Short. White to play. Pause the video if you like and decide what you'll do here. White is massively winning. We've got a black rook blocking this a pawn, and another white pawn over here, obviously. As a general rule, if a rook that's blocking a passed pawn leaves its station, it doesn't do so unpunished. That's what Dvoretsky writes about. So as soon as this rook leaves a5, this pawn can get going, and this black rook needs to do something pretty useful when it's gone missing from a5, if it's going to do something useful and get back to a8 in time. And Kasparov, I guess, just fell asleep and just didn't even check whether that rook could come and do anything useful, and played e4. e4 throws away the win. But it's a very easy win, and he could have followed the principle of, in the endgame, do not hurry. Black's in a kind of zugzwang. Like, it is true that this rook can't leave its station, and he could have just played rook a2. You know, so what does black do here? I mean, if the king gets moved, then you can play e4, because it arrives with check, and king to e3. If the black rook tries the move that was played in the other variation, like rook c5, and we could bring our king to d3. We can even push the a-pawn straight away there as well, actually. Yeah, king d3 is a fairly simple move. And if the rook goes back, I guess we can just keep zugzwanging black, basically. Engine preferred rook a1 there to rook a3, but fine. So instead, we'd see rook a8 maybe, and the a-pawn just gets pushed. The rook can come to h8, but white can just defend his e-pawn. It's just completely gone. So how did this e4 move that was played in the game how did this throw away the win? Well, black's actually got time to play rook c5 and come and nab the e-pawn, basically. A-pawn gets pushed, rook c3 check, king moves, king takes on e4, a-pawn gets pushed again, the rook can get back to c8, a7, and the rook can get back to a8 in time. Now, rook a8 is a draw, but rook g8 check is better. Just get that white king one square further away in the line you're about to see. Rook back to a8, and this is clearly drawn. You'll believe this is clearly drawn when you see what would have happened instead if black didn't chuck in that intermezzo check. Because it looks very easy, doesn't it, that the black king's just going to come over and win that pawn, but white's not finished here. Rook a5, king d4, king f5, king c4, king e6, black has to attack the rook. That finally gets it to shift back to a1. And now black can still lose this. King b5 loses the game to king d6. So you have to play king c5, which shoulders the white king away. So you do still draw it if you didn't chuck in that intermezzo check. But here, I mean, surely you should just chuck in that intermezzo. Even if you don't think it does anything, it's clearly a good idea to get the white king going this way, even if you hadn't spotted rook a5, I suppose. If we go back to this rook c5 move, what if white tried to play rook a3 to stop you coming, playing rook c3 check? Then you've still, excuse me, you've still got time to play rook c4 and come and nab the e-pawn. This looks dangerous, doesn't it? Because, white's got no sensible checks, and there's even a rook swap here, but you could swap and the king's in the square. This is sort of really annoying for white, I suspect. If I was white in this position, I'd be like, black's jammy there. I haven't got a check or something. I've got an extra pawn, for God's sake. Surely that should win. There's just nothing there. So the a-pawn would get pushed again. Rook f4 check, king moves. And again, draw. In the game, Kasparov was lucky, I guess, because I do not believe for 1 second that if he just spent any time at all analysing rook c5 or thinking about this move, he would have, he would have just realised, oh, I can't play that. He's way too good. If you've seen some of his calculations are just mind-boggling, and I basically believe he did no calculation on that. He just was playing a move by hand without any calculation, just thought it was won. But thankfully for him, Short was sort of just similarly obeying the rule that a rook as a blocker of a passed pawn doesn't leave its station. And you could easily have just resigned instead of playing king e6, to be honest. There's just nothing going on. The king comes across, attacks the rook. We see a check, and Short played king b6, Kasparov played rook c4, and then we have the setup I talked about. This rook's also now blocking the black king from getting across. The black king literally can't attack that rook, so white just now marches their king over, and it's over. Okay, so yeah, Short just resigned in that position. Right, next, this is a game from 1973. This is really worth pausing the video on and deciding what would you do as your winning plan. Because, Dvoretsky's got this in his tragicomedy section and regards the first move as dubious. And I agree. so it must be right if I agree. It is dubious, but the engine's got it as the top move. But I agree that it's dubious from the point of view as white's giving themselves a headache they didn't need to have. Engines have it as the top move because engines know they can back up their top moves with the next lot of top moves. But humans can't do that. So what would you do? What's your winning plan from this position? So in the game, the player with the white pieces, excuse me, played rook c7. Very materialistic, holding on to that pawn. But it's a pretty simple win. That the sort of the strategy I talked about earlier on. If you can get king and one pawn plus rook against rook, but importantly get it in such a way that it's obviously just a win, then do it. You know, just let black have your other pawn. King g5 is an extremely simple win. Okay, it was only the engine's fourth favourite move. It's got king h5 as being better for some. I mean, who would ever know that? Why is king h5 any better? What on earth's the difference? But king g5, rook takes c5, king g6. You can see that's completely winning. Black does not stand a chance. I mean, his king's on the long side. You know, so even if his king was on the short side, we know how hard that is to defend. And here it's impossible to defend. It's just a very easy win for white. So yeah, I mean, in your games, certainly in my games, if I'm going to get a position like this, I'm going to be on the lookout for stuff like that. Bearing in mind this example here, where white plays rook c7. I mean, like I say, it's the engine's top move. If you play king g5, engine reckons +5. If you play rook c7, engine reckons +9. But a grandmaster now shows us what can happen to a +9 position. So another reminder, by the way, that when people go, oh, the engine said I was plus this, that and the other, I was 1, it's just like, well, here's a position where a grandmaster was on +9, but the nature of the position meant it was very difficult to convert that +9 into a win. King d8, rook c6, king d7. It's still completely winning for white. Rook d6 check, king e7, and it is still completely winning for white. And again, the best winning strategy is to go into a position that you know's won with rook and one pawn versus king. So if you play something like rook e6 check, king f7, c6 would do it. You've already got oh no, sorry, what I was saying there isn't true. But yeah, rook e6 check, king f7, c6, or if the black king went back to d7, c6 check, king c7. I mean, you can see this is just completely gone for white. Sorry, in that variation, white didn't just give up their other pawn. But instead of rook e6 check, which is still on a +8, by the way, at this point, white played f6 check, and it completely chucks away the win. Black went king f7. They're attacking this c-pawn, so white pushed the c-pawn. And now, to be fair, black does only have one drawing move, but he found the drawing move. You could pause the video and have a go at it if you wanted to. But black played king g6, and there was just nothing white could do. King f3, and the black rook came and cut off the white king from traversing the e-file. King f4, rook e2, rook d5. As soon as the rook came off the defense of the c-pawn, the black rook hit it, back on the defense, rook e2. Black tried this check, just to sort of try and get their king a bit more active. King came to e7, rook d7 check, king e8. King f6, black just stays on the e-file. Rook back to d5, and then comes back and hits the c-pawn from behind. Rook back to d6, rook f1 check, king e6, and black just checks the hell out of the white king now, and even calculates that the pawn ending is drawn. So yeah, in that initial position, you're much better off just, you know, rather than giving yourself complications with this rook c7 move, holding on to both your pawns. You don't need both of the pawns to win. So at any given stage, try and think about, have I got a transposition into an ending I know is won? Again, that comes back to, like, if you've got really good knowledge of rook plus pawn versus rook, you can always be on the lookout for that. No one's going to learn all the various permutations of how to win rook plus F and C pawn versus rook. Like, and if they do, they're just spending too much time learning too many different things. So you know, you'd have to play this over the board, and I'm sure there are better winning methods if you did spend some time learning this particular position. But you don't need a better method, you just need a method that works. And if you can spot a way of getting to a position you know to be won, like king g5, the c pawn goes, but I know that's won from all the work I've done on rook plus 1 pawn versus rook, take it. Yeah, I mean, an engine doesn't want that, but we're human beings. And last but definitely not least, because this one's very hard, it involves disconnected pawns. This time it's black that's in check and having to choose a square for the king. There are 6 choices and only one of them is correct. How about that? You could spend quite a long time on this, and I'd recommend that you did. You know, pause the video and where are you going to put your king? Yeah, so really hard, this one. You have to sort of see to the end of a lot of the variations in the wrong moves before you can understand why the right move is the right move. Although I did actually get this one, which I was quite chuffed with. A good variation to kick off with is king f2. Okay, so king to the f file and attack the rook. And if black does that, white wins just by sticking their rook behind the a pawn. To stand any chance whatsoever, black's going to have to nab the f pawn and then try and get their rook back. But it's going to be very similar to that game we just saw a while ago. I've forgotten which game it was particularly, but where we can just, maybe it was the Kasparov short one. The rook cuts off the king, and so that, you know, the black king can't just get back to the a pawn very easily. And we'd see king e2, king takes h3, and we'll just go through the race. The king has to come all the way over to b2 to attack the white rook. King d6, king b5, rook back to a1. So the king can get to b6, but which I think has actually a transposition to that Kasparov short line where it didn't do the shouldering now, because white can play rook b1 check, king a6, king to c7, rook takes a7 check, and king c6, and black's dead. It was kind of slightly frustrating for black that they couldn't shoulder the king. Where was it? At this stage, yeah. So not king f2. White just sticks their rook behind the a pawn, and it's done. I mean, if just to briefly recap on that, king f2 in that variation, it was rook a3, cutting off the black king. So you think, well, okay, I'll play king f3 then, because that'll probably get me one extra tempo getting cut off on the fourth rank, and I can come along and hit the white rook on b3 in that variation. So let's try that. So king f3, rook behind the a pawn, rook takes f5, a6, rook back. Oh, oops. Rook's gone. So you can't do that. Okay, that didn't work when the black king was on f2, by the way. It's a similar sort of story with king f4. By the way, actually, sorry, I've also just realised that the line I'm going to show you in the king f4 line is a similar sort of thing, isn't it? We could have checked on f1 as... Yeah, let's just go and show that again, sorry. Rook a1 check, I can play rook f1 check there, that's even simpler, which is about what's going to happen in the rook f4 line now. King f4 line now, sorry. So king f4, we stick the rook behind the a pawn, and yeah, black can't take the f pawn because you just play rook f1 check, swap the rooks, and the king's not in the square of the a pawn. So black would have to play something like rook a6, but then you push the f pawn, and yeah, sort of black's in big trouble here. Rook takes f6, you swap the rooks, and then the black king isn't in the square of the a pawn. So we can't move the king to the f file because I mean, the best chance was king f2, but then you saw the black king didn't get back in time to stop the, to help its rook win the blockade of the a pawn, and we got into that variation where it ended like this, with the black king sort of caged to the edge of the board on the a file. So then, okay, you've got to go to the d file, but where? I mean, king d4 is a good idea, because then you're sort of really close to where this a pawn's going to be. Rook a1. White doesn't stand a chance there. You just take the f pawn. That's clearly going to be a draw. And yeah, that would clearly be a draw. But now white just puts their rook behind the f pawn. And there's, this is going to promote, and this can be used to deflect, and the king's going to collect this pawn and come and support the f pawn. It's just completely over. What you really want to do there with the black king is now attack the white rook, sort of give it a bit of hassle, basically. So think, all right, well, I'll hassle the white rook then. This is what was played in the game, king d2, but now you've left too much space this side, and you can't come back and hassle the rook here on d4. Well, you can, but it's going to take you 2 moves. So king d3, a pawn gets pushed. The strategy I talked about again. Rook takes a6, king takes h3, king d4, rook e6. That rook can't be exchanged. Rook a8, and king g4. Sorry, this is the position I thought I was talking about in the last games, because I had sort of a miswiring of the brain. But yeah, here we have got the horizontal cut off. It's a perfect cut. We know that's gone. Go and watch the horizontal cut off video if you want to. But this game finished off like this. And I'm just trying to see how white actually ended up converting it. We got to the Lucena position that way. So it didn't even convert to a vertical cut-off, as I ended up doing quite a lot of my horizontal cut-off messing about against Stockfish. So, I mean, we know what the move is now by process of elimination, but also, hopefully, we know what the move is by sort of, we saw how king to the f file was annoying because rook a1, and there were either tactics swapping rooks on the f file, or even in the king f2 line, the king wasn't fast enough to get back. So you kind of want to go king to the d file to be fast enough to go back. If we go king d4, white switches strategy to the f pawn, and your king is too far away from coming back and hassling the white rook. If you come and hassle the white rook straight away, then rook e5 is played, and your king is too far away from coming back and hassling the white rook. So it's just like, oh, if I go up the board, I then can't go down the board fast enough, and if I go down the board, I can't go up the board fast enough. That line of logic is what should lead us to king d3. If white decides to chuck in a check, we can just go back to e3 and just say that I'm hanging around here until you tell me what your plan is, basically. So that's just sort of going around in circles. We've seen that if we go for the a pawn here, then black's easily going to be able to take the f pawn, come back to a8. Oh God, come back to a8, and this king's going to be close enough. White's not going to win that race. So instead, we'll stick the rook behind the f pawn. I think we're going to end up going for the same plan, but we're just going to get an extra move out of the black king away from the danger area. So king e2. Oh, by the way, actually, the rook e5 idea is obviously a load of rubbish now, because the black king can come in and do a pendulum here, can keep hassling the rook. So that would be a very bad move. So rook f1, at least that drags the king a little bit further away from the action, which is going to be up here. Rook f4, here we see another pendulum, a pendulum of hassle. The only way white can make progress is to say, okay, never mind the f pawn, let's push the a pawn. And we're going to get exactly the same line as we saw before in the rook and the king f2 variation, but crucially, we've got one extra tempo as black out of it. Rook a1, king b4, king e6, king c5, shouldering. I'm pretty sure this is an exact transposition of that Kasparov short game. I think it's the same position. And yeah, king b5 loses to king d6, king b6, and we see the same line that we saw earlier. So yeah, you have to instead shoulder the white king away. King c5, king d7, king b6, rook b1 check. Last chance to mess it up. King c5. Okay. Rook comes into b7, and then you just stick your rook over to h8, and yeah, there's just no way for white to make any progress there. You're just gonna check, check, check the white king till it gets out of there. If rook b8, you can check the white king and take the pawn. It's very difficult to see what move white has here, to be honest. Engine reckons king e6. So, and king c7, well, I'd just start a checking extravaganza after that. So, I mean, that was a 1997 game. It looks like a study. It really does. 6 different king moves. The only one that draws the game by the skin of its teeth is king d3. Loads of good stuff going on there. Very, very hard to analyse all of that from scratch. I did get king d3. I did get the sort of compromise idea. I don't think I analysed every single variation right up to the end. I don't think I got the shouldering thing that's important in that drawing line at the end. But yeah, next time if I get something similar in a game, and I've got lots of time on my clock to think about it. Yeah, that's all the positions I was going to show on disconnected pawns. Hope everyone liked it.